Thank you. Good morning, members, and welcome to this meeting of the Pensions Subcommittee and Board. Just like to say at the start, you might have to excuse my voice. It might disappear, and there might have to be a late substitution to the chair. So we'll wait and see what happens. This meeting is being live streamed and recorded, and will be made available for viewing through our council's website. Remote participants, please follow the good practice guidance, which includes muting microphones and switching off your video when you are not addressing the meeting. Writing speak in the Teams chat function when you want to contribute. If you're in the hall, you can do this on your iPhone or iPad. Kelly, I think you got your mic on. Thanks. Please don't repeat contributions already made by other members. No material should be posted in the chat function if it is intended as part of the discussion. The usual standing orders apply, including that any votes will be undertaken by roll call. If any member has to leave the meeting, please either leave the Teams meeting for that period of time or write leave in the Teams chat function and then join when you rejoin the meeting, so we can keep track on whether the meeting is quorate. All members should speak clearly, taking their time and speaking directly into the microphone when making contributions. When referring to reports, please provide reference to the relevant page and paragraph to allow everyone to follow. Please focus contributions in areas where clarification is required or to propose an alternative to a recommendation. We have several important reports to consider today, and I anticipate, or rather hope, we will deal with the business in our usual efficient manner. Could you provide the sediment and apologies, Claire?
Thank you. For the subcommittee, we have 7 members present. We have 4 members present on Teams, being Councillors Campbell, Dorward, McGregor and McFarlane. Councillor Dryburgh currently not present.
Did you give the sediments for the board as well?
Okay. For the board, we have 5 board members present. 2 of those present on Teams being Colin Graham and Maureen Johnston. 3 not present being Helen Croney, Paul McGrogan and Keith Walters, the Ranger in the hall.
Thank you, and I would like to give my approval for remote participation for both the Pension Subcommittee and the Pension Board. Do you have any declarations of interest for the Pension Subcommittee? No. Any declarations of interest from the Pension Board? No. Thank you. So we have the minutes of the previous meeting of the Pension Subcommittee on 2nd November. Are we happy to approve those? Yep. Minutes of previous joint meeting of Pension Subcommittee and Board on 21st of September. Are we happy to approve, David?
Chair, there was an item in the minute that isn't entirely accurate. I'd like to put an additional point in to the minute if that's appropriate. It is on page 11, item 9. The board had raised concerns about that item and they aren't minuted. I'll read the wording we've got in the board's own minute that predated this one, because I think it's the appropriate wording to put into that item. The board recorded the dissatisfaction with the wording of paragraph 4.10 in item 9 and bullet point 2 and feel that it is unreasonable. So we'd like that. We did have quite a detailed discussion on the day at this agenda item, so we'd like that wording to be included in the minute.
That's fine. I remember the discussion at the time. So, and did you say it was in the minutes of your pension, on the pension board part of it, but yeah, not on the minutes here?
Yeah, yes, it was, but you wouldn't normally get to see those. But I think it would be a good thing, perhaps, to show you them in advance of these meetings as well, just for your own interest.
No, I think that's actually a good idea, David, going forward, to actually have a bit of a discussion about that. Sure. Ivor?
Chair, but was it actually taken as a decision? Because we're looking at, that's a decision from another committee, the board, had a decision. Did we actually include this? I can't remember. I can't remember if that was actually moved and seconded that it should be included.
Okay, but it was as discussed at the joint meeting, is that correct?
Sorry, yeah, it's just to get the minute accurate in terms of what was discussed. There wasn't actually a decision made at this meeting, that is to say the subcommittee meeting of the 21st, or the joint meeting of the 21st. There wasn't any decision made around it, it was just part of the discussion.
Ivor?
My understanding, the minute reflects the decisions made, and that's how this council works usually, that we just reflect decisions, not discussion. So is this an accurate minute as in what was actually agreed that day?
I think from that point of view, you're probably correct, Ivor. I mean, personally, I'm quite relaxed about having that mentioned in the minute.
I fully appreciate what Ivor's saying, but this is a joint meeting, board and subcommittee, and the board had raised that concern itself, and it had made a decision as a board that it wanted that concern to be minuted. So that's why it's in there.
But I think Ivor's point is that there's no actually a decision that was made as such, rather than, because if we get to the stage where we end up doing minutes where we start scribing everyone's discussions or points of view, I think our minutes could become rather lengthy. Stephen?
I wonder if we could check with governance, because one's recording the pension board's decisions and one's recording the pension sub, so obviously we can speak for the pension sub. And I know it's a joint meeting, but that's a peculiarity in itself, so I don't know if governance could assist with how best to record the views of the board as separate from the views of the subcommittee.
Thank you. Claire, have you got any input on that?
Yeah, clearly this is it is a joint minute, so it is a bit peculiar in that way. If board members and subcommittee members were minded, you could add a procedural note to the minute to make an amendment. It wouldn't affect the decision as such, as Councillor Hislop says, but it's up to members really. Yeah, but there would need to be an agreement on both sides to amend, or you can minute that you're approving as it is, but David Stainthorpe may want his dissent recorded.
Sorry, Chair, it's not my dissent personally, it's the dissent of the board that's being recorded here. And it wasn't dissent, it was just a comment on a particular item in the report that was being discussed.
So is there any way we can actually just encapsulate that just to move forward? Paul, any suggestions?
In terms of the discussion, I fully recognise that we did have that discussion at the last meeting, and it was recognised, it was understood why the board were uncomfortable with that reference in the report, and I think it's not inappropriate to reflect that. But from a governance perspective, I also understand where Ivor's coming from, that there was not any formal decision. I think Claire talked about a procedural note. I think I don't know, David, it was because it was maybe referred to as an item of dissent. I don't think it was dissent that you were actually referring to there. It was actually the board was actually making a point regarding the reference in the previous report. So I don't know if a procedural note, Claire, could actually say the board noted or agreed just the words that David had previously indicated there.
Yes, we can certainly add a procedural note, a reference to dissent and referring as if there wasn't total agreement on that, and then that's the process that would be followed.
Are you happy with that, David? Yep.
Thank you.
Right, thank you. Move forward on that basis then. So now on to item 7, the 2023 valuation, the update and review of process. This report provides members with an update on the triennial valuation of the fund. The initial whole fund results are appended to the report. As the committee and the board have had significant changes in membership since the 2020 valuation, officers have asked our appointed actuary, Hyman Robertson, to provide members with an overview of the valuation process, the assumptions used, and what the initial 2023 results are telling us. We have Richard Warden and Jamie Clark from Hyman's Robertson here, and I will hand over to them for the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Hope you can hear me okay. Like you, Chair, I've had a bit of a cough and cold, so I'll try my best to soldier on, but and hopefully I'll last a piece. I've got a glass of water here, so but a warm welcome and great to be here in person as well. It feels like a long time since the last valuation. COVID was just starting at the last valuation, and for those who were around at that time, you might remember there was a big market dip, and it kind of recovered shortly after the valuation date, which is a good thing for the pension fund, but it was very, very uncertain at that point. But 3 years later, here we are, another valuation as required under the regulations. I'm mindful there's a lot of people on the committee who haven't been through a valuation at Dumfries, but some have, some haven't, so we'll try to pace our way through this, and hopefully it'll make a bit of sense to you, and happy to take questions as well. Not a problem. So myself and Jamie have been working on the valuation. We're kind of at the stage where we've got the whole fund results, we've got numbers, which we'll come on to shortly. We're still doing the contribution rate setting side, still discussing that with officers, so that will come later on in the process. We're getting close to that stage, but we're not yet at the point where we can report what the numbers look like. But hopefully today we'll give you a good flavour of what the valuation is looking like. And the thing is, it's good news, which you'll see shortly. It is good news across Scotland and all the pension funds, and we're actually in a surplus position now compared to where we were at prior valuation. So we'll run through the things you see in the agenda there, just a bit of background about why we do a valuation, what's the point, what's happened since 2020, the last time we did it, the results themselves at a whole fund level for the pension fund, a bit about how we set contribution rates and the principles we might use to set those rates, and finally just a mention of this thing called the funding strategy statement, which is kind of a sister statement to the investment strategy statement that you'll be aware of too. They kind of sit side by side. So when we set the funding, we're very mindful of what the investment strategy is doing, because we need that to rely on investment returns along with contributions for employers to feed into the valuation. That's the ultimate output from it. So yeah, please do ask any questions as we go along. At this point, we're doing a kind of joint thing, so I'll pass to Jamie, who's going to cover a few of the earlier slides, and pass it back to me. So over to you, Jamie.
Thanks, Richard. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I've got the same cough and cold as everybody, so bear with me, please. As Richard has said, some of you may be approaching this for the first time. Some of you may be veterans of many valuations. But I think it's a good idea to just take a step back and ask ourselves some big questions. Why do we do the valuation? How do we do the valuation? What's involved in carrying out the valuation? So I'm just going to provide a bit of background to help us along with that journey. So first of all, we could ask the question, why do we do the valuation? Many reasons, 5 of some of the biggest reasons are here. First of all, to calculate employer contribution rates. Obviously, the fund operates to provide benefits, principally retirement benefits, to its members. That comes at a cost, and therefore it has to be paid for. We know that members' contributions, they are set in legislation already, so we know that there's a certainty to that. But at every valuation, we must calculate the employer's contribution rates, which effectively take up the balance of the cost. And we are calculating contribution rates at this valuation, which will come into effect on the 1st of April 2024, and for the 3 years following that. Secondly, we have to comply with legislation, as Richard has already said. Every 3 years, a valuation has to be carried out on the fund. Thirdly, as I'll come on to in a minute, we have to make a number of assumptions when we're carrying out our calculations for the valuation. And the valuation is actually a very good time to look back at the previous 3 years, look at the assumptions that we had the last time, and say, well, have we been close? Do we have to tweak some of these assumptions to reflect the experience that we have today? So it's a good exercise to do that as well. Fourthly, as Richard has said, we use it to review the funding strategy statement, which Richard will come on to later, which is very much sort of the roadmap for the funding of the pension fund for the 3 years approaching. And finally, it allows us to, if you like, carry out a health check on the solvency of the fund. So we can see whether the fund is, for example, in surplus or in deficit at the valuation date. But taken all together, it's a key risk management exercise for the fund, which is used basically to make sure that we're keeping a good eye and monitor on all of these things. So that's why we do evaluation. So the next question might be, well, how do we do evaluation? Well, primarily we take a set of inputs, we crunch the numbers, and we produce a set of outputs. So the inputs are, for example, the membership data that we receive for all of the members of the pension fund. And we must thank the officers of the pension fund and the Ministry Authority for working with employers to provide that to us in a timely and accurate way. So we use the data for each of the members of the pension fund. We combine that with the assumptions that we use. The assumptions are financial in some cases, demographic in others, and we'll come on to that in just a moment. We also bear in mind the funding and investment strategy that the fund is currently pursuing, and we use the LGPS benefit structure. So effectively, what are the rules for these benefits that are being accrued by members? We take those things together, we crunch the numbers, and the outputs are the valuation results, both at a whole fund level, which I know we'll come on to today, but also at an individual employer results level as well. So a solvency of their share of the fund, each individual employer's share of the fund, and also the contribution rates that they will be paying for the 3 years from the 1st of April 2024. We update the funding strategy statement, and effectively the final valuation report is a summary document which basically outlines what we have done, what assumptions we have used, and what the outputs are. So just looking a bit more deeply into how we do the valuation, I said there we're doing a lot of number crunching in the middle stage there. What numbers are we actually crunching? Well, effectively, if we take a step back, we're trying to balance the assets and the liabilities of the fund to make sure that there's always enough money to pay for the benefits that are falling due. So if you look at this diagram here, on the left-hand side you have effectively the liabilities, which are the sort of green bars. Now the liabilities are where we're actually taking the benefits that have been earned up to the valuation date and also looking at benefits that have been earned in future. And we're trying to place a value on those benefits in today's money. Now, what's going to pay for those liabilities are the assets, and that's on the sort of middle side of the middle section of the diagram, the blue bars. We obviously have the assets that we have today, which is, if you like, the market value of the assets at the valuation date. And then we also have what's going to be paid in future to pay for future benefits as well. Now, there's a red line on that bar there, the sort of the blue bar that's sort of most central there. A red line which is really showing the balance between future contributions and future investment returns. So, for example, that's where the benefits are going to be paid for. Now, where you draw that line will be an important consideration for the pension fund. If, for example, you could decide in theory, well, let's have a lower contribution rate environment, then in order to pay for the benefits, that would place more of a burden on the future investment returns. The opposite side of that is if you say, well, let's pay a higher level of contribution rates, then you would be able to be slightly less heroic with your assumption for future investment returns. So it's an important judgment to draw that line at the right place and take into account the circumstances of the fund and of employers. Now, as at the valuation date, the 31st of March 2023, as Richard has alluded to, it's good news, the fund is in surplus. And we've tried to just show that there as the funding level. The assets today, the dark blue bar, are slightly bigger than the liabilities earned today, which is the sort of dark green bar. And so the funding level is more than 100%. So it's relatively straightforward to find out what the value of the assets are. That's just their market value at the valuation date. But to try and put a value on what the value of the liabilities are, that's where some actuarial mathematics is required. And in a nutshell, we can look at it this way if we take a step back and think about it. If we just consider one member, let's think of one employee member, for example. At the valuation date, looking forward, they will work for a number of years forward until they retire. When will they actually retire? That's not actually known with certainty at the moment. And so we have to make an assumption about that. When they retire, they will receive their retirement benefits. First of all, they will receive a lump sum, which is shown by the sort of large pink bar there. And they will also receive a pension, which is the smaller pink bar, which will then be paid for the rest of their life. Now, how much of their benefit will they take in lump sum and how much will they take in pension? We don't know that for certain. We have to make an assumption about that. When they receive their pension, how long will they receive that pension for? They'll get that for the rest of their life. How long will they live for? What's their life expectancy? We don't know that with certainty. We have to make an assumption about it. When they die, they may have a dependent, their dependent will then receive a dependent's pension until they die. When will they die? What is their life expectancy? Again, we have to make another assumption about that. And while these pensions are in payment, they are indexed, so they rise currently in line with CPI. So we have to make an assumption about what CPI is going to look like during that period. So all of those assumptions there allow us to look at the benefits that will actually be paid at retirement, and we then need to bring that back to the valuation date and try and put a single, if you like, monetary value to all those benefits that are going to be paid in future. And we would do that by using an assumption for future investment returns. So, if you like, that's what we do for one member. We then need to scale that right across all the members in the pension fund who are different ages, different genders. They may be working as officers or manual workers. There's lots of different assumptions that we have to make. But those are the assumptions that we use in order to calculate the liabilities. Now, in the olden days, what we would do is the fund would work hard to come up with what we would call deterministic assumptions. So, for example, for the future investment return, we would look at the circumstances of the market on the day. We would look at how things are going to pan out going forward. We'd take the fund's investment strategy and we would come up with a single number. So, for example, we would assume that 6% per annum was going to be yielded by the fund's investments, and we were going to use that to generate a value for the liabilities. Things have moved on since then. We now have the computing power to take a much more real-world approach to these things. So we can effectively run many valuations. And in fact, we use 5,000 simulations. So we're effectively running 5,000 valuations, if you like, to show the spread of outcomes that you could get if these assumptions are not borne out in practice. And every simulation is one set of assumptions, which in some cases are correlated as well. So the future investment return assumption is correlated in some way to the inflation assumption. So we're looking at real-world scenarios. And what that does is it allows us to then take a risk-based approach and understand that these assumptions are volatile and can give a multiplicity of outcomes. But we can effectively draw a line and agree with the fund what would be a prudent place to place the assumptions at, and what outcomes would we get if we used those assumptions. And we use that to determine the contribution rates as well. In the diagram there, over on the sort of right-hand side of the diagram, we've got sort of two sections. We've got a section where the outcomes lead us to a scenario where we're less than 100% funded after 20 years. And the upper section shows where we're greater than 100% funded. So we want to be greater than 100% funded over the long term. And so we want to set our contribution rate so that we have a high probability of reaching that outcome. So that's why we do evaluation. That's a flavour of what we're trying to calculate and how we calculate it. If we just take a little look now at what's actually happened since the last valuation. The wider funding context, if you just look at the chart here, the green line, this is for sort of an average LGPS fund. The green line is effectively tracking what's happened to the assets over the last 3 years. The blue line is tracking what's happening to the liabilities. And actually, where this chart starts is just after March 2020, which would have come just after the big fall in the market value of assets because of COVID and lockdown and whatever. So what you're seeing in the green line is the assets beginning to recover quite strongly since March 2020. The blue line, the liabilities, if all our assumptions were borne out in practice, would track very closely to the asset line. But what's actually happened is that towards the second part of the period, you can see that the blue line of the liabilities has actually begun to fall, and you can see a very sharp sort of correction almost taking place towards sort of August last year. A few things happened in August last year which upset the apple cart slightly economically. And what's important to look at here is that the fact that the liability value is going down here reflects higher interest rates. So as a general rule, as you increase interest rates, that will reduce the value of your liabilities and vice versa. And so you'll see there's a divergence opening up between what's happening to the assets and what's happening to the liabilities. And in this case, the assets are now at a higher valuation than the liabilities, and therefore we have a surplus. So two things have happened. The assets have done better than expected, but the liabilities have actually fallen, which we did not expect at the last valuation. So looking at these assumptions, some matter more than others when we're calculating the valuation results. And we'll just try to stratify this slightly and show which ones are more important than others. Right at the top there, you have the future investment return assumption. That is how we discount back the benefits that are going to be paid in future and try and come up with this value in today's money. Now, that's a key assumption and it's very sensitive. So your valuation results will be very sensitive to that assumption. And the key thing here is that we're actually choosing that assumption based on the Dumfries and Galloway Council Pension Fund's own asset portfolio and the expected returns that we expect from each of those asset classes. We also allow for a margin of prudence as well to make sure that we're not being too heroic with that assumption. We also have an assumption for CPI, for benefit increases that are going to take place in future. Obviously, we've been in an interesting inflation environment as well. We're in a higher inflation environment at the moment. So the inflation assumption is also very sensitive when it comes to the outputs that you get for your valuation results. As you work your way down, the assumptions become less, or the results become less sensitive to some of these things, but they're nevertheless very important to keep a handle on. The longevity assumption is very important, and the key thing here is to just reiterate that our longevity assumptions are tailored to the members of your fund. They're not off the shelf taken from somewhere else. They reflect your membership and their own particular circumstances. Salary increase assumption is very important. It's becoming less important simply because the final salary element of the pension scheme is beginning to fall away. Obviously, since 2015, it's a career average scheme, and so it's less. It's not influenced by salary increase assumptions. It's influenced by CPI assumptions. So while that's an important assumption, its importance is beginning to wane as we move on. And we've got other demographic assumptions, things like a withdrawal assumption. What's the probability that someone will leave before they retire? If they leave, they will then get deferred benefits. Things like death in service benefits, ill health benefits, that sort of thing. And the key thing here, just to say about the assumption in conclusion here, is that these assumptions are evidence-based for your fund. They are not simply lifted off the shelf from any other fund. We look at your fund circumstances, and our assumptions are determined to suit your fund's own particular circumstances. And we provided recently a paper where we discussed with the pension fund officers how we've derived our assumptions and what we believe the best assumptions would be, but that is open for discussion with the fund. So that's why we do a valuation, a bit about how we do the valuation, and just a discussion about why we use assumptions and why they matter. And with that, I'm going to pass back over to Richard to discuss the rest of the assumptions.
Thanks, Jamie. Any questions so far? Has that been okay, I hope, so far, kind of as an introduction? Feel free to jump in if there are, or we'll take them at the end, whatever, excuse me, whatever suits people. If not, I'll crack on. And so I'm just going to drill a little bit into the key assumptions that Jamie mentioned there. Not all of them, but just the kind of key ones to give you a bit of a flavour of how they work. So, big one is, as you might imagine, is what we call future investment returns, or the discount rate is sometimes known as the discount rate. And just to explain, this is a wee bit Janet and John, but it's trying to just bring to life what actuaries do, because it's a key part of evaluation. So let's imagine the fund had one liability only, and it was just to pay out £1 in a year's time. Right, so that's clearly not the case in practice, but let's imagine it was the case. And so in a year's time, you've got 1 year to invest that money. So what would we value that now in today's terms if you had to meet that £1 in 1 year's time? Well, that depends very much on what interest you can get. So if you had access to a bank account at 5%, good luck to you, but if you could, find one with a 5% interest rate, you would put aside 95p now. And with a 5% interest, you would get your £1 in a year's time. In other words, the discounted value at 5% of that liability of £1 that's due in a year's time is 95p. So that's what we call the kind of present value. So actually sometimes call it present value or discounted value. However, if interest rates were lower and you could get less money in interest, so say it was 2%, that means you have to put aside 98p to meet that £1. The £1 hasn't changed, you still owe £1 to the member, but you have to invest 98p now. You get 2% interest, 2p, and you should get your £1 back in a year's time. But the point being that because the interest rate's gone down, you've got less interest, you have to put more money in now. The value you have to put in now to meet that liability has gone up. It's gone up to 98p from 95p. And in many respects, that's basically what we're doing at the valuation across every member. And so we're looking at what do we owe, what does the pension fund owe in the future? And it owes lots of money to lots of people at different time periods. And we have to discount all of those payments back to a current date to place a value on the liability. So that's effectively what we're doing. And the big thing that's happened over the last, well, as Jamie explained there, is that interest rates have shot up. So in other words, the amount of money that the portfolio in theory can get in future has gone up. And so that's why the liabilities have gone down since 2020. So it's a big feature of the valuation, not just for this fund, but for all pension funds. And you've probably seen a lot of headlines out there about improving funding positions across pension funds. So that's a key reason for it. So that's the future investment return. That's the most important or financially material assumption. And this is just to highlight actually what's been happening here. This is just comparing the 2020 assumptions across asset classes in the portfolio, the fund's portfolio, against where we might stand now at 2023. And you'll see the x-axis is the rate of return on the asset classes at 2020. The y-axis is the equivalent of 2023. And if they hadn't changed all the dots of the various asset classes, we would be sitting on that dashed line, that diagonal line, if they hadn't changed. But you can see that in every case, they're all to the left-hand side of the chart. In other words, the expectations have improved or increased since 2020 across all the various asset classes. And it's all been driven by interest rate rises, not just in the UK, but across the globe. So that will have a positive impact, a big positive impact on the 2023 results. Second biggest one that Jamie mentioned was CPI or inflation. So the benefits are all linked to inflation pretty much in the LGPS, so a really important assumption. You'll all be aware of inflation rocketing over the last year or two. So short-term inflation has been really high. The last pension increase order at 2023 earlier this year was 10.1%, so really high compared to what it's been for the last decade or more. It's starting to come down. You probably have seen the next pension increase order is 6.7% from April next year, so it's come down. That's a backward-looking measure. That's a kind of lagged thing based on CPI to September. So we think it's likely on the kind of median line, but you'll see there's lots of lines in the chart on the right-hand side of 50-50. Our best educated guess of where it might land is that it will be a bit higher than the 2% Bank of England target over the short term, but it will start to go down towards that target and possibly even below that target over a longer term. We do stress test that risk-based approach that Jamie mentioned. We stress test inflation within those 5,000 scenarios. So some will have stagflation, low inflation, or high inflation, low growth, or vice versa. So we kind of stress test that inflation assumption. You'll see there on the right-hand side the kind of levels it could get to on the fringes of some of the outcomes. So it could be quite low, it could be quite high, but our best guess is that on average you'd expect it to be a bit higher than last time, like the 2020 assumption, but perhaps not going as high as some of these extremes. But you never know. That's the whole point of the stress testing. It's important we stress test different values for inflation to get a measure of how uncertain it could be going forward. So that's inflation. And the other big ticket one is, and Jamie again mentioned, longevity, so life expectancy, how long people live. Clearly, if people live longer, the pension fund has to pay out more money. A couple of things on this slide you can see. First of all, Jamie's explained it's all tailored to your membership. So we do so-called longevity curves based on various characteristics of the membership. On the left, sorry, you maybe can't see that well, this is what we call a heat map. It's kind of zoning in on broadly the Dumfries area. And of course, you'll have members who live outside Dumfries, obviously, might have retired, moved elsewhere, so that's all allowed for. But in broadly, most of your membership will be around about there. And it's kind of just showing that the blue areas are areas of lower than average life expectancy. And the green ones are higher than average. And you'll see it's quite a variety there. And the point about that is, I suppose, that you'll have a variety of different members in your fund, and we're trying to capture as best we can what we think their future life expectancy might look like. The chart on the right is just tracking based on observed data from Club Vita, who look at a lot of data from LGPS funds. It's tracking how life expectancy has improved over the last couple of decades. There's a bit of a split there between it. Vita did a bit of analysis around affluence, because that's quite a big issue for life expectancy, as you might imagine. And they class it into comfortable, making do, and hard press. And you'll see across all groups very strong growth in life expectancy. This is based on observed data over 2000 to 2010. So there's about 2 years of improvements baked in there over that period. But if you then go from 2010 to 2020 and beyond, you'll see that it's starting to flatline a bit. Still improving, but the pace is slowing down, the pace of improvement. So I think eyesight's going a bit here, but it's about 0.5, 0.6 years rather than 2 years. So you'll see there's still improving, but a much slower pace of improvement. And COVID, obviously, wasn't good for longevity, clearly. And so when we set the assumption of this valuation for improvements, we're not factoring in a lot of the COVID experience, because that's likely to be an outlier. But we're keeping a close track on what's happened post-COVID to longevity and to death rates. This slide all talks about what we call baseline longevity, observed rates, based on the data, actual death rates. The other thing that's much more subjective, of course, is how that improvement chart will go on into the future. What rate will people live to in the future? And as you might imagine, highly subjective. There are headwinds and tailwinds. So the bits in blue, the headwinds we've called them, on the left are things that perhaps might reduce life expectancy or reduce the pace of improvement. So things like obesity trends, resistance to drugs such as antibiotics, and so on. On the right-hand side, things that perhaps might improve life expectancies. So diets, for example, or new vaccines, cures for various diseases, and so on. Technology feeding into that as well. In summary, actually, when you kind of combine the two together, there's a slight reduction in life expectancy assumptions at this valuation compared to the last one, but it's not that material. Slightly less, but not materially less, and that's purely because we're reducing the rate of improvements a little based on the trend line you saw earlier. But we keep a close tab on that, and we analyse it quite closely over time. So, all the other assumptions, I won't go into them because we don't have time today to talk about the other ones, but those were the key ones. So how does that translate into a kind of single, if we were to present the funding level, we're required by the regulation to present a single funding level at the evaluation. So what does that mean for these assumptions? So you'll see on the right-hand side the 2020 assumptions. So at that point, the discount rate or the rate of investment return was 3.4% per annum. That was what was reported. Inflation was pretty low at 2020. Expectations 1.7%, and the salary increase rate was CPI plus, well, that's 0.8%. And these are all 20 years assumptions. They're over the next 20 years, the kind of average over the next 20 years. If you then fast forward 3 years to 2023, I've mentioned interest rates increasing, so a discount rate we're going for this time is 5.2%. I should say, incidentally, the likelihood of that under this risk-based approach, which you can base on confidence levels or likelihoods, we've upped it from 70 to 75% to take advantage, if you like, and to build a bit more prudence in around that assumption at this valuation. I think one point worth raising is that interest rates, these are all future-looking, and there's a lot of uncertainty baked into them. It feels appropriate when you get a valuation where you've got a rapid rise in interest rates, not to assume that will automatically mean you're going to get global stellar returns for the next 20 years. You've always got to be a bit cautious about that. So whilst we're reflecting what the market might think and what the interest rates mean, we've been a bit more cautious on the discount rate or the rate of investment return than we could have been, otherwise could have been. But still an increase, a big increase to 5.2%. Inflation I mentioned is going up, so 2.3% is the kind of 20-year average, if you like, the best estimate. And salary increases, we've kept that margin in place there, so 3%, 0.7% above CPI. And just in the bottom, just a bit of information, a table of life expectancies across pensioners and non-pensioners. These are from age 65, so you'll see there not a lot of change from 2020 on the right to 2023, a slight reduction across the various categories you can see there. You've got a question?
Thank you. It was just on the assumptions there about life expectancies. So obviously there's a slight drop, which I don't know if it's significant or not, but we'll see over time. But is that, so 20.6 years, for example, for a male pensioner at the age of 65, so those who have reached the age of 65, so the average life expectancy for those would be 20.6, and presumably that's for local authority workers as opposed to the general population, because I think the life expectancy is slightly higher for public sector workers than it is for the normal population. So I'm just sort of wondering, but even that's still quite high, because that means your average male local employee retiree at 65 will live to 86.6, or 85.6, which seems encouraging to say the least. But I mean, is that the right assumption there? Or are you taking it from age 60? Because it refers to age 60 in other parts of the report.
Yeah, it's that's 65, this table. So it might be 60 elsewhere, but this table's 65. You're right, it does seem, and it's a common comment. It's interesting, we ran a poll recently, and people consistently underestimate life expectancy, but that's based on observed data, most of that. That's kind of saying, we're building a bit of improvements in future, but for pensioners who are that kind of already retired and are at that age, that's what we're seeing in the data. And we're seeing actually there's a differential, so that's not population data will give you generally lower values. So if we base that on the Scottish population as a whole, it would be quite a bit lower. There are kind of what we call protection effects from being in the fund. You've got a steady income in retirement. You've been probably working steady income during your lifetime as well, when you were an active member. And that's got a big, what we call protection effect in terms of longevity. You get higher longevity. But we see actually when you look across the UK as a whole, even at LGPS fund level, there's about a 10-year difference between the one, Kensington and Chelsea. I imagine I've got a really, if I had a table for them, we'd be up at the 25, 27-year mark versus the very lowest fund, which is about 10 years less. But they are higher than the population ones. And the bottom one, two in the table, ones that say non-pensioners, they're people who are currently 45 in the fund. And The ones you figures you see are from age 65 for them. So it's implying, for example, there's improvements over a 20-year period of about 0.6 years for a male, for example, over the next 20 years. Just to give you a sense of what it means in liability, broadly a 1 year improvement, a 1 year difference is about 3% of liabilities, 3% of the total liabilities broadly. So that sort of magnitude of what it means for the fund in terms of the liability impact.
Scottish National Record, the statistics office that Scottish Records are kept on, that has a lower life expectancy by a few years compared to what you're saying there. So, but this is a projection as well. But that's not based on current figures, or is that? Are you getting different data sources for that?
This one, first of all, is based on the fund, tailored to the fund's membership. So it's very much LGPS data. It's not national population data, and it will be higher. So I don't know exactly the figures. I don't have the figures to hand for the kind of national population stuff, but it will be higher. And yeah, that bakes in, those numbers bake in improvements as well. So there's some observed data, there's a lot of observed data going in, but there's also future improvements being baked into those assumptions, because we have to allow for the fact that we are trying to cover a very long time period here. So it's a combination of things. So the actual observed ones will be lower. In fact, if you go back to these trend lines, they're kind of more about the observed things. So you can see they're a bit lower, not much actually. They're a wee bit lower, but that's a kind of average across all funds, LGPS funds. So, but that's tailored. This table here is tailored to Dumfries. So that's the Dumfries figures, if you like, the assumptions for Dumfries based on their own population, the Dumfries and Galloway membership, if that makes sense.
Moira, you wanted to come in with a question?
It was just in relation to the longevity. I think it's quite noteworthy that for this valuation, we're saying life expectancy is decreasing in Dumfries and Galloway for this year around it for both males and females. But I do wonder whether, if we're taking a cautious approach to the modelling and the assumptions, whether we should be neutral in terms of the longevity.
Yeah, I should have said, sorry, where we build prudence into the assumptions is through the rate of investment returns. So these are best estimates you see here. Now, what we've done on this, the reason why you're seeing a reduction, and I'll just go back again to this, it's probably this chart's perhaps the best one. So if you were to cast your mind back a few valuations, we were seeing a trend line that was really steep, two years per decade. But the evidence is growing that, in fact, the improvements are slowing down. Still improving, so people are still living longer a bit, but the rate of improvement's a lot lower than it ever was. We're ignoring COVID experience because that's in theory a one-off. Clearly death rates were higher, but I don't think it's right to build it into assumption and say, yeah, that's going to happen. Having said that, even since COVID, I don't know if you've seen a few headlines of excess deaths in the population. You might have seen that. So it seems that whether it's a post-COVID effect, there's probably lots of things feeding into that, but certainly it appears that the rate of improvements, they're lower. The improvement rate's lower than it was before COVID. And that trend line, you can see it is flatlining. It's starting to flatline. If you look at all of those figures there are definitely flattening out. So what we've done is try to reflect some of that in the assumption, which is why they've gone down a little bit. When you kind of, once you sort of factor it into the Dumfries membership, you end up with this table here, so slightly lower than it was, than what we thought might be the case at 2020, which was just at the start of the pandemic.
So we're, as part of our assumptions for this valuation, we're saying it's declining.
We're saying it's not going to improve at the rate we thought it would improve at 2020. The rate of improvement's lower. It's not declining. It's a lower rate of improvement. So instead of maybe, instead of 5% per annum or whatever, or 1%, it's 0.8% per annum. Does that make sense? So it's improvement. It's still going up, but at a slower rate. And that's the thing that's driving down. Because we are comparing an assumption with a higher rate at 2020 versus a slightly lower rate at 2023. And that's really why it's overall a bit lower. Yeah.
Stephen, did you want to come back?
Yeah, it was just a very quick comment on the map there where it shows the longevity in the sort of darker blues, less longevity, if you like.
Yes.
That's often we're sort of our position is that we've got a very low GDP or GVA, whatever it is. So we're sort of poor, but we live longer. Was that sort of how you would summarise that in a tweet?
It's yeah, it's all relative, isn't it? But as part of me, sort of stepping back for a second, looking across the LGPS, we typically see low life expectancy in metropolitan areas in particular. It's because there's all sorts of things feeding into that, you know, whether it's poverty, there's even air pollution, there's a number of different things. Affluence is a key one, so that does generally push up, and that's why Kensington and Chelsea, for example, tend to have really high levels, generally a very affluent part of the country, and their lifestyles reflect that. There's a joke, and I'm Glaswegian, okay, so I can say this, but there's a Glasgow versus Edinburgh effect. People talk about the West of Scotland effect, and the diet in particular in Glasgow, and you know, it does come out in the figures. You don't get to see that as much in Dumfries. I know you're on the sort of westish, but you know, it's sort of, you know, but you're away from big cities up here, and you dare say you have people who probably stay in big cities. You know, you have a varied membership, but in general, you're arguably a bit more. You tend to see better life expectancy in more rural locations, if that makes sense, or less urban. But again, you know, your membership will be based all over the place. That's the thing. So it's not, we can't just generalise here and say it's, you know, you're all living in a, you know, you'd be a mixture of members in the fund.
So I think that, because I'm taking this as meaning when you're talking about Kensington, I'm presuming you're saying local authority workers in Kensington.
The Kensington Chelsea Pension Fund, but again, they'll have people working, there'll be people from outside London who are in that fund and who maybe worked in London for a time. And so the fund consists of active members, deferreds and pensioners, and you'll find, you know, a lot of pensioners don't stay necessarily in the local region when they retire. They move to the coast, they move abroad, and all that stuff gets factored in. So it's quite hard to pinpoint one reason why the rates are what they are. It's really, you know, we could do a whole session on the factors and causes and why, you know, looking more closely at the kind of profile of the membership. We don't have time today, but that's an interesting session in itself. You can delve into the detail behind some of that, the numbers here. So, okay, that's good. Thanks for the questions. Okay, so we've talked about the key assumptions and etc. So now, Jamie mentioned we do this number crunching. And so you feed all these assumptions in, you apply all the membership, and you end up with a set of valuation results. A lot of number crunching going on. And here's the numbers. Those who were here last time might remember where we were. So at 2020, and this is what we call the balance sheet. So the funding, this is past service only. It's the funding level past service benefits. So it's really important we remember that there are still future service benefits to be earned going forward. This is an open scheme, and so the cost of paying for the scheme is past and future. So this is past service only. And you see on the right hand side, past service liabilities were, hopefully my eyesight's terrible these days, 900, does that say 900, Jamie? 900, right. So we've got 900 million of liabilities split across the three membership classes. So you've got active members, employees, current employees, deferreds and pensioners. So that comes to 800 million last time. Assets at that point were 820 odds. So you had a deficit of 75 million. And the funding level, when you divide the 826 by the 900, you get an answer of 92%. So not a bad position. You weren't far off, fully funded last time. And plans were put in place, of course, to collect money. Deficit, what we call deficit contributions, to make sure we could close that gap over time. And incidentally, this is I'm sure you'll appreciate, a snapshot in time. It's at the valuation date. It changes daily as the markets change and conditions change. This is really just for presenting what the valuation number looks like, to give you a kind of steer about the trend. Is it good or bad? So last time 92% funded. You see there immediately good news in terms of the headline figures. So liabilities, again, driven mostly by this interest rate rise, we're calculating at 824, so actually come down a bit, and that's despite future accrual, so 3 years worth of accrual by active members, so there's kind of extra benefits in there, if you like. Despite all that, the liabilities are still a bit lower at 824, Assets have done well. They had that particular strong start to the valuation period post that big dip I mentioned. We've kind of flatlined broadly in the last maybe year, 18 months, but still a good outcome. And just over £1 billion for the first time possibly at a valuation, I think. So we've reached just over £1 billion mark. And so your difference between those two numbers, 178 million to the good. And a funding level dividing the two numbers, one by cover, you get 122%. So it's a great outcome. Again, I mentioned driven some asset growth, but actually reliability is a big thing, the reduction in liabilities. So that's good news. So that's the whole fund level. When we do the contribution rates, which I'll come on to shortly, we're more worried about how the funding level is going to look at the end of a longer time horizon. So that's what when we set rates, all about looking further into the future and how many outcomes will be successful above 100% funded. So, but that has to get reported. So that's the thing that will end up going into our valuation report and get published. And this is a Scotland-wide phenomenon. We're all up. They're all looking good in Scotland, which is great. So, just to give a little bit more detail around this. Sorry, this is slightly busy, this chart, apologies, but it's quite, I find once you get your head around it, it's quite useful, I think. So what it's showing, we call it a tramline report, a tramline chart, or we do anyway, and it's showing on the x-axis the assumed investment return. I mentioned that 5.2% earlier, 2023, or the 3.4 I think it was last time. So it's on the x-axis, you've got assumed investment return expected from your portfolio of assets. On the y-axis, we've got the funding level, 122% I mentioned there, and we've got two lines there. We've got a green line and a blue line. So what it's saying is, and this is what it's kind of saying is, if the assumed future investment return, as all assumptions are just educated guesses, and so we can do a risk-based approach and catch some confidence levels to what those numbers might look like. So at the last valuation, we attached a 70% confidence or a 70% likelihood of success to the assumed investment return. And that gave you an assumption of 3.4%, I think it was. You'll see there's a diamond there. I think it's a pink diamond at the 70% line. If you track your eye downwards, it kind of crosses the x-axis at 3.4. Okay? But equally, if you were wanted to be more prudent at the last valuation, and reporting the funding level, you might have chosen either a higher likelihood, or if you wanted to be less prudent, a lower likelihood. Okay, so what these little dots there on that line are basically just saying the funding level can go up or down, depending on what level of confidence you want to apply, what likelihood you want to apply. So that was the position at 2020 green bit. If you then build in all the 2023 assumptions, it shifts strongly to the right to reflect the fact the funding position's improved on average. So you look at the blue line. I mentioned that we're using 75% this time. So if you track your eye down to 75%, it cuts the x-axis at 5.2%. But equally, if you wanted to stick with the 70%, if you wanted to be a bit less prudent of this valuation and go with 70%, you could report a funding level that's better. You could use 5.7%, for example, which equates to the 70% line. And magically, your funding level would go up to 132, I think it is, from memory, and so on and so forth. And so, report the funding level we have to do, but do be aware it is a snapshot in time, and it really depends on how prudent you want to be around that investment return assumption for reporting purposes. There are a few stats on the left-hand side that I think are quite interesting. So I mentioned 122%. A minute ago, the funding level. But actually, if you wanted to be, if your target was just to be 100% using this approach, rather than 122%, you need future returns of about 3.8%. So I mentioned 5.2% earlier, but if you were aiming to be 100% funded, if you like, your required return is about 3.8%. So it's fairly lower than the kind of what you hope to get in practice, if you like. And the likelihood, even better news, the likelihood we think of getting 3.8% based on all those assumptions we mentioned is 92%. So there's a strong likelihood that the required return to be fully funded on that set of assumptions it's strong. 92% is a very strong likelihood, a strong level of confidence. Just by comparison, if you go back to 2020, sorry, just a wee question there.
Yeah, so it was just on that change from the 70% to the 75%, because I think the 70% was 2020 threshold, if you like, or guide or assumption. So is the 75% just indicative at this point, or is it like actually we're going to review the prudence to change it to 75%? Because it seems like a sort of choice.
It's a choice. We're seeing, this is a subject we had, our view is that it's a sensible choice to do given the surplus position and the fact is it feels like there's a lot more uncertainty out there than there was at the last valuation in terms of an interest rate. It's sharply risen up. We did discuss it with officers and we bounced it around and thought, well, listen, I think the surplus had gone, the fund position improved so dramatically over a short space of time. We felt it was important to build a bit more prudence into the reporting. I should say this is just purely for reporting purposes, so it won't affect the contribution rates, which are done using a separate approach, I have to say. So this is purely for reporting. It's kind of, so the English valuations also saw improvements, and I appreciate that funds can have their own decisions about this and their own risk appetites, but certainly the trend has been for the likelihood to go up a bit, take advantage of the fact we're now in a strong funding position, and to hold back a bit or to build a bit more prudence into the funding plan and into the reported funding level. So, yeah, but it is subjective. There's a rule of thumb that generally 70% or above feels like a sensible place to be, but if you go beyond 80, it gets awfully prudent as well, so you're kind of trying to get that balance right. So.
Oh. Fair enough. I was just going to ask someone as well.
Yeah, so it was just when it does come to, because obviously there will be, our members will be interested in the contribution rates, but it could be taken from this that, well, let's now look at this assumption in terms of how we calculate the contribution rates, given this higher level of prudence that we're suggesting. So while it might be a choice and indicative just now, I can see how that could be used to inform a future decision about contribution rates, which might not be as beneficial to members in their perception. So I'm just sort of wondering, how do we approach that through yourself, Chair, to Paul, for example?
Yep, so as Richard has explained, we did discuss the change in the level of prudence reflected in the valuation. Paul, we've spent a bit of time discussing life expectancy this morning, but we're probably at the stage now where it's been less volatile the last couple of valuations. It's not having that big an impact on the overall position, the movements there. But the discount rate is the big factor here, and it has moved up fairly substantially since the last time, and it's probably having an eye on the potential for that to move again going forward. So given that, and given that increased volatility, we felt it was sensible to move to a slightly higher level of prudence in terms of reporting the overall level of funding. Also discussed that with a couple of colleagues from other funds as well, who to some extent have done a similar thing. So that's what was taken into account. But I think, Stephen, probably what you're most keen to kind of consider is how might this impact on the contribution rates, particularly for the council, but for other employers as well. This won't directly impact on that. It's a different set of numbers. It's a different set of not the same assumptions, but it's a different consideration in terms of what the future contribution rate requires to be. The probably other thing to say is that effectively the actuary has to sign that off. At the end, it's not a member decision. It's not a council decision. It's actually the actuary who actually confirms and indicates the funding level, although they do take into account discussions with ourselves and on various assumptions and the approach to be taken. So this approach will not directly impact on the contribution rate considerations, but we'll come back to members with further details on that.
Thanks. It's worth mentioning, there's a slide at the end that might be hopefully a wee bit helpful in that respect as well, because it talks about the principles that the fund will think about when setting rates, and one of them that springs to mind is that thing about uncertainty. So when we do that risk-based modelling with 5,000 scenarios, we're kind of saying, well, we're all equally likely to happen because no one can predict the future. But I think there's a general feeling that there could be some asset shocks out there that we need to be mindful of, particularly in climate is one, and geopolitical might be the other one. So I think it's when you see a big change in a fund position, just be careful, don't go gung-ho necessarily and assume there's lots of money suddenly. It's been driven by liabilities, it hasn't been driven by asset returns. So just keep that in mind. We're relying on the future panning out in a way that we think it might happen. This is a model, and we all know that you've got to be careful when placing reliance on models and confidence levels. Just have a dose of common sense. But there's a slide at the end that might help a bit to think about some of the principles around rate setting to bear in mind when doing that. So.
Yeah, Richard, it's just, if you turn your mic off.
Sorry.
Looking at this, it's almost as if you've looked at it and saw this valuation increase, and you're almost thinking, it comes across as there's a element of dubiety about, or is it too good to be true? And is that partly why we went to the 75%? And I think being more cautious after this particular change is a valuable way to go. But
I think that's right. I mean, it reminds me, having been doing this for a long time and going all the way back to the credit crunch and before the credit crunch. I always think running a pension fund as a long-term investor with a long-term time horizon is don't overreact to good news or to bad news. The credit crunch, we could have ramped up rates. We didn't. It wasn't the right thing to do, because the chances are the market would recover over the longer term. And equally, everybody will have different beliefs about where interest rates are going. But there's been an unbelievable rise in interest rates, and most consensus are we might fall a bit. And we're kind of building that in to an extent. But I'm always just mindful that just be careful about overreacting or doing knee-jerk reactions to a number that, frankly, can wobble about all over the place. And it feels like the world's a fairly uncertain place at the moment. And there are lots of risks out there, some of which are modelled, but some of which, frankly, are quite hard to model. And just basing rates on the fact you suddenly got this surplus has emerged, I would suggest for a long-term time horizon investor and long-term open employers, you just got to be cautious. That side of the end, actually, I'll talk through some of the principles, because I think that kind of comes out for that. I'm not saying there shouldn't be rate reductions, but just just always, again, with any valuation, just urge caution about how you get that balance, that red line that Jamie mentioned between relying on future returns versus contribution rate reductions. There's always a bit of caution around that, getting that balance right. So. Okay, and this slide is really just as a reminder, I suppose, that you might be aware that within the Pensions Act, which is a UK Act, there's a piece of legislation called Section 13, and it requires the Government Actuaries Department to look at all the local funding positions and local funding numbers across the Scottish funds and rebase them onto a standard set of assumptions. So the chart you'll see there is just showing where Dumfries and Galloway sit in amongst all the Scottish funds. Dumfries and Galloway are on the left-hand side, so they're a bit lower than the average of Scottish funds. The highest one to the right there in terms of funding level on the standardised basis is Orkney Islands, so one of the smaller funds. And you'll see Strathclyde and Lothian are kind of placed second or third in terms of that. The overall position actually in Scotland is good for all funds, all in surplus. It's just that relative thing, how you compare against other funds and what rates are being paid. And you'll see broadly the better funded schemes tend to pay a lower contribution rate, which isn't that surprising. So that's just the position at 2020 versus your peer group, of the other Scottish funds, effectively. There will be another one of them done by the Government Actuaries Department at the back of 2023. They tend to take a wee bit of time to produce them, so we probably won't see that for a couple of years. But just a reminder, that goes on. They have this overall national check on solvency, if you like, the government does. Okay, talked a bit already about contribution rate setting, so that's a key output for evaluation. We do all these numbers, but the bottom line is employers like to know what we're going to be paying over the next 3 years from the 1st of April. So how do we do that? We have a 3-step process. the fund's got, I'm going to say, 8 to 10 employers in it. And what we do is we consider 3 things when setting rates. We look at the funding target, which generally for most employers you'd expect just to be, well, meeting 100% of the liabilities, having enough money to target, 100% of the value of the liabilities. There might be the odd employer that's close to new entrants, and so there might be a slightly different approach used for them, slightly more prudent assumptions to provide protection from the fund when they finally exit. But most of the employers are ongoing, and so the funding targets are a relatively straightforward one to set. We then think about the time horizon, which would typically be 20 years for a longer term employer, but might be lower for any contractors that the fund has got, for example, or any closed employers. So that's kind of step 2. We look at the time horizon over which the rate's payable, and the point at which we're trying to be fully funded. And finally, that likelihood success feeds in again, but that's a different likelihood. It's the same principle in a way, but it's not the whole fund one that we use for reporting. And that's the one where we think about how risky or otherwise the covenant of the employer is, their financial strength. So the theory being you set it, if you think an employer is good for its money and is in for a long term and can perhaps raise taxes or has strong funding or strong assets, you might set a lower likelihood than you would for a more risky employer, where perhaps you need to get the money in more quickly. So we think every employer has a likelihood of success attached to them. And you'll see from the current FSS that if you were to go in there, you'll see what the likelihoods were at the last valuation. So we'll be thinking about them and just speaking to officers about, the employers at this valuation and sense checking what that likelihood might be this time round. So that's that 3-stage approach. It feeds into the contribution rate. We also have, for one employer, and that's the biggest one. Sorry, is that working okay? It's a wee bit crackly, isn't it? I don't know if that's better. We also have, for one employer, the council. There's what we call a council pool, so it's the council itself and various employers that have got links to the council or perhaps had contracts with the council in the past, historic employers. So for that one employer only, we operate something called a contribution rate stability mechanism. And now the idea behind that, because they're a long-term and secure employer, the idea behind that is that their rate is stabilised. So it's not fixed, but it's stabilised and subject to fairly small changes in the rate over time. And the idea being that if you do that, you kind of cut through the peaks and troughs of funding. So you're in a really bad position, a strong deficit. They underpay relative to what they might otherwise have paid if you ignored the CSM. Or equally, if you're in the good times, so if you've got a strong surplus, you keep the rates a bit higher than they otherwise might have been if you just took full advantage of the full surplus at that time. The chart on the right, which is just an illustration, is trying to just demonstrate that principle. So the target rate without the CSM might be high or it might be low, but the idea is that the actual rate kind of goes through the middle of these quite volatile rates at each valuation. So it kind of reduces volatility for the council. And it's only because they're a long-term secure employer in the fund with plenty of time to cover deficit and surplus, basically. So the principle is overpay in the good times and underpay in the bad times and keep the rate at a stable rate if possible. It's all in the FSS if you want to read more about that. You'll see the top bullet. The current CSM parameters are 0.5% or -1% of pay overtime. So in other words, at the moment the council's rate can go up by 0.5% per annum, so say 1.5% max over a 3-year period, or down by 3% of pay over a 3-year period. And we'll be looking at that as part of that contribution rate discussion that's currently underway alongside the rest of the employer results. So yeah, I'll let you, it's a wee bit crackly, isn't it? Am I too close to it? Is that the problem? Sorry. Can everybody hear me still? Is that? Sorry, that was my fault. I'm terrible with microphones. So, anyway, I'll carry on. I wasn't eating a microphone here. This picture here is just, look, this isn't Dumfries, I should say, but the pattern is very similar to Dumfries. This is going back in time, all the way back to 2002, I think. Apologies, I think it's going back about 20 years of valuations, and it's just looking at a typical Scottish fund. And it's really just making a point at this. It's quite exceptional what's happened at this valuation in terms of the funding level. So the deficit's been the norm for the last 20 years. And what the fund's been doing over the last 20 years has been managing that deficit. Rates have gone up a bit for employers, not hopefully are still affordable. They've had this kind of process of paying a wee bit more into the fund and relying also on investment returns to do a lot of the heavy lifting. But the good news is, of course, we've got a big surplus now compared to what we've been in the past. But I suppose it's making a point that deficit has been the historical norm. Hopefully it won't go back to that anytime soon. But having surplus is a new thing in the fund. And I think that picture, I'm not suggesting it will necessarily reverse again, but do again, just when you get an exceptional thing like that, you just be careful about utilising all that surplus. Just sometimes it's best keeping some of that in the bank, because things can change quite quickly. And they have changed very quickly over the last year from where we were. So that's just giving you a wee profile of what things have been like historically for the fund and other Scottish funds. So we're in surplus, mentioned that. So what do you do with it? Obviously, you can reduce employer contributions, so bring them down a bit, give a bit of relief to employers. I'm sure they'll welcome that. You can review the investment strategy and appreciate that's a separate item, but you have done some work in that area. And that you can sort of de-risk, or you can invest in different options to perhaps give you a bit more stability in the funding position. Or you can just do nothing, frankly. You can just keep the surplus, keep it as a cushion, and that gives you a kind of buffer against future adverse experience. So if people live longer or if inflation ramps up, you've got a bit of a buffer there. And I think in practice, quite often funds will do a bit of both, a bit of all of that. And so we don't necessarily just immediately reduce employer contributions all the way down to a really low level. We don't necessarily drastically change the investment strategy. And quite often we will do add in a bit of a buffer, but not go really prudent either. So it's a bit of a balance there. Just to remind you again, that strap line at the bottom, the funding level is past service only, so it's only based on accrued benefits to the valuation date. You've got all these future service benefits you have to fund for, and a big part of the contribution rate paid by employers is funding future service benefits, stuff that hasn't been earned yet, but we know will be earned. So future service is the biggest part of the contribution rate for the employer. The deficit part's not as big, so just bear that in mind, that we need to what we tried to do with the valuation is come up with some sort of sustainable long-term rate to cover future service benefits, ultimately. So with that in mind, we mentioned we're currently in the process of looking at contribution rates, discussing them with officers, doing the number crunching. So what sort of things do you have to think about at this valuation when it comes to managing surplus? And these are all things just, I suppose, we'll bear in mind when we're discussing them. I've mentioned already this knee-jerk reaction. Just be careful. It's a snapshot. It changes daily. It can change very quickly, up or down. So just to be aware of that. The surplus, actually, it's not investment performance that's really driving it. Over the last 18 months anyway or so, the investment performance has been broadly flat, so the assets haven't necessarily increased much. They have since COVID, at the start of COVID, but not over the last 18 months or so. So really what we're seeing in the surplus is mostly liability assumptions that are driving it, rather than the assets going up. I mentioned the CSM point. If you want to stick to principles of the CSM, you just got to be careful about going vastly beyond the CSM parameters just because you've got a big surplus. The idea is you hold back a bit of money under the CSM for the inevitable bad times that might be around the corner, because we know economies and markets tend to be cyclical. This is more a practical point 4 there, about increasing contributions. If you're going to reduce contributions, it can be awfully painful for employers to increase them again. They tend to budget for whatever rate you tell them, understandably. And if you then try to ramp up rates at the next valuation, say, because the surplus is suddenly gone due to some event, we might go, well, wait a minute, You can't really afford to add on an extra 2 or 3% of pay to your budget. So it's kind of just to be mindful about. It's taken a lot of pain, I suppose, over the last decade to get rates to where we are now. And do you want to go through all that pain again? So just to sort of to be mindful about increasing rates. Reducing rates is easy in a way, but not increasing them, that's quite a difficult task. Fifth point is just the thing about future service. Bearing that in mind, future service benefits really important. We have to make sure we're funding towards them. And there's always this kind of intergenerational thing, which is if you take more money now out of the fund by reducing rates, are you just basically putting more costs onto future generations? So how fair do you want to be across generations in that respect? I mentioned already the second last one about volatile market conditions. I'm sure you're all aware of that, and the fact there is quite a lot of kind of unmodelled uncertainty out there. It's quite difficult to attach a value to, if you like. But clearly, climate change is an ongoing challenge for society, for markets, for the fund, and everybody else. And obviously, there's a lot of geopolitical things going on currently in the world that could lead to market shocks as well. I suppose in summary, we've got a duty to be consistent and a proportionate across all the fund employers. So it's not just about the council either. They've got a CSM, but we've got to think about what we're doing for all the other employers too on rates. It's a good picture, but I suppose when the rate setting happens, we just need to think about all these principles, if you like, when doing the rate setting, and we'll do that in the coming few weeks actually, because we're quite close to that stage now. Okay, I think this is the final slide, and it's just to mention this thing called the funding strategy statement we talked about earlier. So you've currently got one, and we kind of review it every 3 years to reflect evaluation. It has to be consulted on with employers, so that will be part of that process, is to go out with a draft to employers along with their results. In line with SITFA guidance, we have to do that, the fund has to do that. But what does it do? The key principles, where it kind of talks about how the fund manages risk. It talks about how we set employer contribution rates, the stuff we've talked about this morning. And it talks about other funding policies, so things like cessation policies for employers. How do we handle an employer exiting the fund? What's the process? What assumptions apply? What's the cessation valuation? How do we do that, etc. So that's all in there as well. It's a governance document. I've mentioned these already, actually, the bottom points. It's required under the regulations, so the fund has to do it, and they have to consult on it as well. So I suppose that's all. You could read the document if you like. It's quite a big document, but it's quite a useful document and a kind of guide to how the fund funds itself, funds its benefits. And so that's all we had to say, I think, this morning, but happy to take any more questions if you've got any more, but thank you for the ones you've asked already.
It's more a comment than a question. It's, we went through about, a decade of what to me were, exceptional interest rates. And at the moment, you made the comment about interest rates have risen, quite strongly, but in reality, we're only really getting close to the trend, for the long-term trend, because you've got to appreciate with this, we're in this for the long term here. So it's the fact that we weren't surprised when the interest rates were so low that comes as a surprise to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, could give you more. When I started work a long time ago, interest rates were 15%, and I think my first wage rise was 20%, and I was a young guy. This is great, but then, even mortgage rates were really high, etc. And we got used to that really low level of interest rates, but that was an abnormality across time. As a long-term investor, you're absolutely right. So I think we're more in a normal place. Arguably there might be some more movements, maybe downwards a little bit, but our modelling 10 years ago was kind of predicting. I'm not suggesting we knew in hindsight, but it did predict that we thought interest rates would rise over time. So we didn't think, I don't think anybody predicted it would rise that much in a year, but we are in a more normal interest rate environment, I would argue, than where we were 10 years ago. It's a good point. It's a long-term game, pension funding.
When I was studying we spent a lot of time doing net present value accounting and things like that, which obviously just went completely out of. It wasn't required because inflation was benign and interest rates were low. But I mean, spent an awful lot of time, various models trying to make that work. David, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. On page 29, you mentioned the cost cap valuation on 2020. Now, my recollection was, when we discussed that at the time, was that there was a possibility that benefits might increase, but for the fact that McLeod interrupted that process, so everything was put on hold. If that was the case when we had a 92% valuation, now that we're 122% valuation, is there going to be any impact of a cost cap?
Yeah, sorry, I have to confess, I didn't cover the cost cap in any great detail there, but in fact, I didn't mention it, sorry. But you're absolutely right. So the cost cap, again, is a national calculation. As you'll know, it applies to every single fund. It's done in a very different way. So really, your local funding results, so things in particular investment returns and investment performance, that kind of doesn't feature in the cost cap. So it uses a set of kind of almost treasury, His Majesty's Treasury assumptions effectively. You're absolutely right about the comment about McLeod. So there was meant to be a set of benefit improvements coming in. I'm going to say 1st of April 2019 maybe or something, but that sort of date's relatively small. But because of the McLeod remedy being put into a cost cap, that's kind of negated, it's taken out, it's brought the cost back within the corridor. They've got this kind of corridor approach, whereby if the cost, when we assess the cost every, I think it's 4 years, and it falls within the corridor, we don't make a change. So the expectation is the 2020 cost cap valuation, which we're still waiting on. Directions were put in place recently about that, so we're expecting results quite soon. The expectation is that will have no impact at all on the benefit structure or on the employee contribution rate. The idea is that if the costs of the scheme measured using these national assumptions, if it falls quite far, the theory is that the benefit structure improves or the employee contribution rates come down a bit to reflect that. But from what I'm aware of, the expectation is the 2020 results will have no impact at all on the LGPS at all. And so the next valuation will be 2024, and who knows what will happen then.
So just to wonder about that, because this is all about assumptions for the future. If we're all sitting at far higher levels of funding than we were back in 2020, have you got an expectation that there might be some changes to that?
No, because the local funding valuations make no impact. It's done, but this cost cap it's quite hard to explain. It's really technical for a start. We use something called escape rate, which is the rate that is linked to the GDP growth. So it's not linked to fund returns. So this, I've been talking today about 5.2% and based on the portfolio for Dumfries. When they do their valuation at a national level, they ignore asset portfolios and they base it on this thing called escape rate. And broadly, the escape rate reflects the growth in the economy, so it's pretty low. So it's just bizarrely, they won't necessarily see big increases in funding level under their approach. And it's not even funding level. They're looking at the cost of future service only, really. They kind of ignore the past. It's all about the future service. Is the future service cost sustainable on their set of assumptions? And it goes to pages long. It's a huge algorithm. But it's all, you won't recognise the assumptions. They're not anything like the assumptions I've talked about this morning. They're national level. And we generally apply, the problem about the cost cap, they've kind of pigeonholed it into the assumptions they use for unfunded pension schemes like the civil service scheme or the NHS. So they're trying to fit the LGPS into that. So you end up with a kind of what I would call a bizarre set of assumptions being used because they don't really apply to a funded scheme. They apply to an unfunded scheme which relies on taxpayers to fund it. So the civil service scheme, there is no pot of money. You know, it's literally paid by taxpayers. So they're kind of trying to use economic growth as a measure for the rate of return. But it's a nonsense, in many respects, a kind of nonsense calculation for LGPS. But that's what we do, and it's written in the legislation, we have to do it. So
No, thanks for that. I mean, you're giving me a whole lot of information that I really don't understand. But the key point is you don't expect that to lead to anything. Yeah.
Sounded good.
Tony, do you want to come in? Oh, and Moira.
Thank you. On page 27, and you discussed the salary increases is based on a 3% per annum assumption. Does that take into account the recent pay award that local government staff received in Scotland, which ranges from like 9.5% to around, I don't know the exact figure, but like 5%, something?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it exactly models that exactly. That because that's a 20-year assumption. It's kind of looking at the sort of inflation rate over 20 years, trying to build in a bit. There is a bit of a short-term higher inflation built into that. I don't think it models exactly the pay awards. So we haven't sat down there and gone through all the details and applied to the full membership. But it does allow for higher short-term salary growth, but lower in longer term. I think that was something we discussed with officers, and we agreed that it felt like keep linking it to CPI, the same margin over a 20-year period felt okay to us, but there is an allowance for higher short-term salary growth. I can't confirm. I have to say I'm not convinced we modelled exactly in line. We didn't drill down to every single member in that respect, so because we're setting a long-term assumption rather than just a 1 year or 2 year assumption. If that makes sense.
Thanks. And I also wanted to ask on page 21. We're assuming that there's going to be better returns going into the future based on the returns in between 2020 and 2023. What are the reasons for those assumptions that?
Sorry. So that's a very much a forward-looking assumption. So it's got no reliance. So the 5.2%. Sorry, I haven't got the slide there, but I think it's 5.2 out of 75% likelihood. It's kind of taking the portfolio, the Dumfries portfolio of assets as it stood at valuation date, 31st of March 23, and running these distributions of returns going forward, allowing for the fact that interest rates globally have gone up, allowing for market conditions and what we think might happen in each asset class, and adding it all together and coming up with a kind of, this assumption, which is 5.2 out of 75% likelihood. And if you chose 80%, it would be lower, or if you chose 70%, it would be higher. But that's very much forward-looking, so it's not saying what happened between 20 and 23. Actually, what happened between 2023 is another reason why the funding level's a bit better, because the performance was better than the discount rate or the rate set at the 3.4 at 2020. The fund exceeded that over the last 3 years, and that's built into the funding level. But actually, the key reason for the big increase in funding level is mainly due to the interest rate rise. There is a bit of investment performance in there in the first 18 months or so, which helps the funding level as well.
So it's mainly the interest rate that's causing it to be 5.2% rather than lower?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you reduce that discount rate, the rate of investment return away down, I think the funding level would have gone up a little bit, but you wouldn't have seen this big stellar improvement.
I was a bit surprised reading in your slides when you were on about the fact that the funding level would now have potentially an effect on the investment strategy. Now, why would that be? Because surely our investment strategy should be trying to get as good a return as we can get. I don't really see why we would suddenly change strategy just because we're better funded. It's almost like I've got more money in the bank, I'm going to work a bit less.
The reason I mention that is because if you've got enough surplus, you might think, well, listen, perhaps we can de-risk a bit, take a bit of risk out, but still keep, to help stability and balance sheets. But I agree, as a long-term investor, Ian, you hopefully you could chip in here, but I would suggest that as a long-term investor, you're probably not going to make swingy changes, but it's just something you sometimes see, and it is an option. If you've got a lot of surplus, you could do something in investment strategy if you wanted.
Yeah, I just wouldn't like to think Ian's going to get an easier job. That's the real thing.
No, I think we're coming from a position where we've got a good balanced investment portfolio now. I think if we were sat there on 100% equities and had a really strong funding level, we'd probably say we should probably be taking a bit of risk off. to prevent there being huge volatile swings in the asset level and the funding level, which might mean employees need to contribute more. But I think now we've got a strong funding level, but starting from a well-balanced portfolio that I don't think we need to make big changes to.
Thank you. If there's no further questions. Oh,
I had one more question. Just on page 34, it refers to, I think it's on page 34. Oh, no, page... Sorry, it was just there was somewhere in the report it referred to non-investment costs of 2.4 million. And I wondered if we can have a breakdown of what they are. I think that was in this report.
Is that perhaps, that's not in the slide, is that in the initial results report perhaps?
I think it was in the pack that we just...
Yeah, I think, sorry, I don't have the report exactly. I think that refers to the expenses of what we call administration expenses. So I think that reflects a 3-year figure of the cost of running a fund. So not investment expenses, but everything else. Governance costs, systems costs, costs of hiring Hamish Robertson as an actuary or your auditor, your custodian, stuff like that. I think that's where that 2 point... So it comes directly from the report and accounts. The annual report, the fund's annual report and accounts, a 3-year figure, I think it is. Have I got that right? I think that's what it is.
Okay, thank you. I'll have a look at that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
so with no further question. Tony?
Finally get in. First off, I had difficulty seeing some of the graphics on that projection. I would actually like to have, if possible, sent out the life expectancy graphic, because it will, personally, it will make me look at my financial future, decide where I'm actually going to impact, what impacts I'm going to have. So that's something. That aside, you mentioned also one of the variables, or two of the variables, which in close to your end was climate change and geopolitical circumstances. Now, the climate aspect of that is a little bit more predictable because we know where it's going, and so we have computer modelling, and certainly there are actuaries and insurance companies that have number crunched this quite significantly, and they already know the change, but not maybe the rapidity of the change and the consequences of the change. So that is an aspect which in your modelling you will have to do, but also the bigger component, which is the geopolitical, that is total uncertainty. So how do you combine, or how do you value the two in your modelling? Because one is a projection which is predictable, and the other is a projection which is unpredictable.
Yeah, and I think so we don't, there's not, I mentioned, sorry, Jamie, you mentioned the risk-based thing, the 5,000 scenarios, and that covers a huge range of good and bad outcomes, but it's not saying, listen, scenario number 1,000 is the situation in the Middle East or the situation in Ukraine. It's not saying, it's not looking at that. But I think if the fund's taking, when you look at the modelling thing, if you think there are things out there that perhaps tilt your views a bit towards the downside rather than the upside, that's when I think that likelihood figure, for example, would be one reason why you might increase it. So likelihood, you kind of toggle that if your view is that, listen, these scenarios aren't all equally probable. Perhaps there's it's a bit more likely that there'll be some bad climate outcomes and thing we're looking at within Hymans, and we're about to sort of, it's constantly evolving. The climate, we have done climate scenario. I haven't shown it here actually, but it was shown to officers. But we're developing what we call kind of narrative-based scenario shocks, like food shocks, for example. And that's a whole new topic in itself. But it's those sort of things. It's like, how bad could it get? What would happen if, a certain narrative happens? And I think ultimately what happens when you do that, that's when you think about, well, listen, there might be a bit of surplus, but we probably should be holding some of that back, because that's how you can handle shocks. If you've got surplus, at least it gives you a bit of room for manoeuvre if something bad happens out in the economy. You've got a bit more comfort that you've got, something absolutely catastrophic happens, it's very difficult to do anything about it in the fund or society if something really bad happens. But you would hope that those risk-based scenarios would cover most of the bad outcomes. And you'll see some of them go really low in the funding level, where there's a huge crash or a stagflation, really low growth, high inflation, or there's a big asset shock. And that, who knows, but that could happen if geopolitically there's contagion to other countries and there's a bigger conflict somewhere, for example. But it's very hard to model specifically what it is, albeit efforts are being made, as you say, and insurance companies who cover catastrophe risk, for example, and all sorts of things. They've got a real skin in the game here to try to do it. And we're doing as much as we can to speak to insurers, to speak to climate scientists, and so on and so forth. We do a lot of work in that area. I know that Ian's colleagues do a lot on that too.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. That was quite understanding. So, but I would like a graph of that life expectancy.
Thank you. I think we can circulate that. That should be okay. Yep. So we'll make that happen. So thank you very much for your presentation, Richard and Jamie. I certainly found it quite interesting. But can we just move on to the recommendations? So at 2.1, we're asked to note the draft of Dumfries and Galloway Council Pension Fund 2023 valuation result. And 2.2, note the overview to be presented by Hyman Robertson on the valuation approach, which will then be circulated as well. So thank you very much, gentlemen. That's very good. So we'll move on to item 8, the Dumfries and Galloway Council Pension Fund Risk Register. This report provides an update on the risk register of the fund. The risk register pulls together the information that was previously held on council, service and team risk registers into one single register for the fund. The register has been prepared in the Council's standard format and is focused on those risks that will most significantly impact on the key objectives of the fund. The draft risk register is provided at Appendix 1 for members' approval. Going forward, the risk register will be reviewed quarterly by officers and annually by the subcommittee and board, with updates brought forward should there be any material change to any risk. Karen Donaldson, Rose Fraser and Isla Herrick are here should members have any questions. I'll just open the questions on that. Moira?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask in relation to the actuarial valuation, is that reflected in the risk register in terms of any decisions that are made, say for example on contribution rates? Does that get reflected in the risk register and how we mitigate those?
Karen, so we can help.
I suppose there's not a specific risk for actuarial valuation. However, I suppose employer contribution rates having to increase or decrease can be as a result of, for instance, the investment strategy not delivering the intended returns would obviously impact on the valuation that would then impact on employer results. So it's kind of embedded in other risks, although there's not one specific for the valuation.
Yeah, I just wonder whether we should have, a row for the risk of the decisions that are made as a result of the actuarial valuation and what guides us as a fund to mitigate against those. For example, setting the contribution rate too low for employers.
I think from what Karen's saying, really, and which is really the valuation is basically a result of the entire performance of the fund in it, and it's almost like taking a composite of all these factors, which results in the valuation. Am I correct in that assumption, rather than just having a risk as to the valuation?
Yeah, I just feel like we could add that risk in, although I feel it would just maybe duplicate risks that are already inherent in the register, but happy to take that on board and consider that for sort of future iterations of it.
No, thanks, Chair. I think Karen's covered that. I think for at present, we do refer in the risk register to the returns of the fund in terms of the overall funding level for the pension fund, and also refer to employers' contributions in the register as well. So I think it's covered to an extent. I think, Paul, the other point is I wouldn't view the decisions in relation to the contribution rate to be a risk for the fund, because they will be absolutely taken in line with actuarial advice and with professional advice as well. So that's how we will look to set the employer's contribution rates. So I think it is effectively covered in the risks that are reflected in the register at the moment. But as Karen says, certainly look to maybe take that into account for future developments on this, if that's okay.
Is there because the biggest effect that we've had on that from this evaluation has really been on the liabilities. Is there a risk element in this for the change in the liabilities? Because liabilities could go both ways, couldn't they?
I think in terms of the register, what we're trying to do is reflect those risks that we're actually able to control or have some influence on, or take some measures to mitigate. So I think that's why it's not specifically referred to in the register at the moment.
Stephen.
Thanks, Chair. Page 59, there's a key person risk, I think, alluded to there in terms of the staff training and succession, given that it's a small team. So it's in the sort of red box in the little risk matrix, and the target's obviously to be in a yellow box. So I suppose it says there, it talks about further succession planning required, I think. So I'm just sort of wondering what's action's been taken just now for that, and also on the sort of emphasis on training, which obviously is key to staff. Obviously, we have a training register later on in the report. Do we have the same sort of assurance that all staff, such as they are, have met all the required training in a similar sort of way? Thank you.
Happy to answer that from the investment side. I mean, in terms of the investment and accounting for the fund, we do have succession arrangements in place, and we've kind of developed in recent years, obviously with Andy, who was heavily involved, at a kind of revised approach going forward. I think there's a greater degree of resilience there in terms of the approach and the numbers involved in that, but it's something we need to continually review and make sure we're updating skills and training in that respect. So that's something I do feel is in place in terms of the investment accountancy side. I think probably the bigger concern we've got is the kind of the depth of resources. At the minute, there's an increasing level of demands on the team, and the numbers are restricted, so that's something we are currently looking at. I think I'm right in saying that the kind of placing in the red section of risk register is referring more to the administration.
Also, each member of that team also has a training plan. It's a different training plan to the one that board members and committee members would be involved with, because it's specifically about regulations and running the administration of the scheme. But everybody has that, and it's very comprehensive for the staff that we have within the team at the moment.
So in terms of the plan, I was just sort of wondering what the plan looks like, because obviously there's discussions would happen, but I mean, further planning is required. So I'm just wondering, okay, if that's required, then that's a requirement, and if it's a plan, then it'll look like something. So I'm just sort of wondering what that would be. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think taking that into account, what we'll do is myself and the Head of People and Transformation maybe get together and see if we can look at the plan to ensure that it covers the administration side as well, if that's okay.
Okay, David.
Thanks. It's a more general point about the risk register process. There's obviously a lot of different risks in there. They're all at different, well, most of them are in different places. So in terms of the way the council deals with that, is there some sort of timetable or time scale involved once a risk has perhaps gone into the red to get it back into yellow or green, or is there anything formal in the council processes about how that's done?
Paul, can you, or Karen?
No, thank you, Chair. Yeah, well, our intention, again, is to put the risk register onto Pantana, the council's performance sort of management system, and that will ensure that it is flagged for regular review. And I said, like, myself, Ross and Isla and the team meet together monthly anyway, so it's like once a quarter. Our intention is to keep reviewing the risk register as part of those meetings. And obviously we don't want any of the risks in the red. Ideally we would want them all as close to target as possible. So obviously our focus will absolutely be on those higher risk ones and anything we can do to bring our assessment of that risk down. So I suppose it's just, we'd hope that maybe this time next year we would again be seeing progress of getting the risks closer to target. And I said probably like sort of the resourcing of the teams is probably the big consideration in getting that down, and there's a lot of regulations sort of coming up that require resourcing, so that is going to be our sort of our key focus, is managing the risks. So it will be on us as officers to keep those risks managed.
Thank you, Karen. Andy McFarlane.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yes, just following on from David's question, really. I think when you look at the risks, it's easy to see where we are when we've actually taken that snapshot. But what isn't clear, and based on the presentation we've had this morning, talking about travel and how things can go and how they can't go, but it's not clear to see if we're actually making progress in relation to these. I wonder if it's possible that we could actually have some sort of indicator if we're improving or getting worse in relation to the movement from red to green or green to red, even if it was just in the comments, you know, the narrative rather than some descriptive. But if we could get a direction of travel, I think that might be helpful, because it would mean that we'd be able to sort of challenge or support. Thank you.
Karen.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I mean, certainly can take that into consideration for the next time we bring this forward to the committee. Obviously, this is the sort of first version of everything being pulled together, and we've tried to put in the latest position in the end column, which is obviously trying to indicate how we've assessed the risk. But certainly, as we continue sort of routinely reporting this through the committee and board, we can flag any areas which have changed considerably, or if there is any sort of trends there. So happy to take that forward for as part of the annual review of the risk register.
Linda, you want to come in?
Thank you. Good morning, Chair. Or good morning, members. Good afternoon. No, good afternoon, everybody. Lost track of time here. In terms of page 62, the risk PF06, is this risk primarily due to the fact that we have current global uncertainty, and is it basically out with our control in terms of how we can manage this? Because what it says is we've got a good fund, we've got good mitigations, and in terms of latest position, the fund has a good funding level, 92% at 2020 valuations, which enables the fund to accommodate times when investment returns are low. But really, the fund can't do any more than it can, apart from watch what's happening out with the fund, if that makes sense. A bit complicated, but thank you.
Karen.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I think that is one of the key risks, and because investment returns are so sort of market driven, that to an extent it is out with our control, but through our sort of routine review of the investment strategy, making sure we've got that balanced strategy kind of helps us combat that risk as far as possible. But I suppose that risk does recognise that there are factors out with our control that influence on that. But I think we're in a fairly good place to be able to manage that risk.
Thank you. Any further questions? No, so just move on to the recommendation. We're asked at 2.1 to agree the draft Dumfries and Galloway Council Pension Fund Risk Register, and 2.2 agree the risk register will be reviewed quarterly by officers on an annual basis by the Pensions Subcommittee and Board, and we'll need to take on some of the suggestions that were mentioned to bring that forward for comparators and everything else. So we're happy to agree that. Thank you. Now move on to item 9, pension fund update and emerging issues. This standing agenda item provides an update to members on the current and emerging issues relevant to the pension fund. This report highlights the progress being made on the implementation of the fund's updated investment strategy, as well as the annual review of investment manager objectives. The paper also provides an update on the committee and board governance review. The report requests approval to set up a short life working group to provide additional opportunity for informal discussion and debate on the governance review prior to the preparation of the final version of the governance document. If this is agreed, the subcommittee and board are asked to nominate one member each to be the representative in this group. Karen Donaldson is here to answer any questions members may have. So I'll open up to questions. Councillor Beretti.
Yeah, it's in relation to 2.4 in the short-term or short life or short-term working group. Not quite certain which is possibly to say. How long would a member sit on it, and who exactly would be the best member to be put on?
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. Our intention is that it will be really short, and it will be between now and the next committee in March when we're sort of developing the proposals. So we're only looking at a period of a sort of maximum of 3 months at this stage. And with regards to members to sit on it, obviously having a little bit of capacity, I'm not anticipating the role to be too onerous. I'm hoping to be able to keep it to a couple of meetings, 3 at most, I would hope. But obviously someone with kind of a good understanding of the regulations and like what we're required to do by law. Obviously, because any changes we need to make sure that they are in accordance with the regulations, and obviously just anyone with sort of interest in resolving, or if they've got any particular issues with the current, or understanding of the current issues that have been flagged through recent meetings. But certainly wouldn't expect it to be too onerous. And just to add that I've already made good progress on developing the governance arrangements. I have got draft documents ready to get that sort of further review and discussion on. So I'm hoping we can complete the group fairly quickly.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So when would you expect this to happen? Because if we agree it and go forward with this group, when would you expect the first meeting to be?
Early in the new year. Certainly be in a position to, as soon as we've got the membership, to set that up and get a look at diaries.
Thank you. David?
Thanks, Chair. It's on the same point, recommendation 2.4. The board met earlier this morning, or earlier today rather, and looked at that recommendation. We're very happy with it as it sits, but would like to expand on it a little bit. In section 4.11 of the report, it suggests who would be on the short-term working group. While it's entirely appropriate for those folks to be there, we felt that it was a little bit restricted in terms of the board's remit, which is a little bit wider than the subcommittee's remit. So we had a discussion about that, and the decision we made was that we would like someone from the admin side of the pension fund to be included on that short-term working group. So specifically, we thought it would be reasonable for the team leader pensions to sit on that short-term working group as well.
Yeah, I think that actually sounds quite sensible. Paul, do you just want to come in on that?
Just to confirm that, more than happy with that suggestion.
Okay, so any further questions? Karen, you want to come in?
Yeah, so I just wanted to provide a quick update on a development since we drafted the report with regards to the M&G residential property investment. I think it was said in the report that we would be due to sort of transfer funds by the end of March. M&G have been in touch with us this week saying that the paperwork's all been accepted, that they would be in a position to move in our investment in December. So we're just sort of finalising arrangements with them. But like the position with Barons, the transfer will require us to hold a significant amount in cash for a short period of time. So there will be a requirement to breach the the normal sort of bank counterparty limits. So it's just to kind of flag that to the committee and board that that'll be required. But once we've got the final arrangements and dates, we'll get the formal approval through yourself, Chair and Vice Chair, and Chair of the Board, and obviously the Head of Governance as well, just to do that like we did the last time. But it was just to flag that it looks likely that we'll be able to progress that sooner than we initially anticipated, and we'll get the relevant approvals once the process is finalised, hopefully at some point this week.
Yeah, thank you for that update, Karen. So if there's no further questions, we'll just move on to the recommendations. So my iPad's nearly charged up, so I can take it off its cable eventually. Right, so recommendations 2.1, note the update in relation to the implementation of the agreed investment strategy as detailed at paragraph 4.1 to 4.4. Note the annual review, 2.2, note the annual review of investment advisor objectives for 2023 and that these objectives will remain in place with an addition in relation to providing advice on climate-related financial disclosure, TCFD requirements as detailed in paragraphs 4.7 to 4.9. Note the update in relation to the Pension Subcommittee and Board Governance Review as detailed at paragraph 4.10 to 4.12. 2.4. Agree to set up a short life member and working officer group to provide an additional opportunity for informal discussion and debate around the Governance Review and nominate one representative from the Pension Subcommittee and one from the Pension Board to sit in this group as detailed at paragraph 4.11. Are we actually going to nominate someone today, or are we prepared to take it forward? Paul?
Obviously, it's a decision for both the committee and the board, but we'd be very keen just to be able to get the arrangements in place if members and the board felt as though they were ready to do that at this stage.
Tony?
If we're going to nominate today, Chair, I'd like to nominate Moira from the board.
Thank you. Stephen?
I was going to suggest yourself or either as Chair or Vice Chair just to be the nominee from the Pension Subcommittee.
Thank you, because I was going to suggest Councillor Stephen Thompson might have been quite good in that working group.
I'm honoured that you thought of that, Chair, but I think it'd probably be more symbolically appropriate if the Chair or Vice Chair would do that. You can fight amongst yourselves for it, I guess. But
Thank you, Stephen. Well, unless Ivor's got any objections, I'm quite happy to take.
I would stand.
So you can nominate myself. Well done, Stephen. 2.5, note the current emerging issues that will impact on the pension fund as detailed at paragraphs 4.13 to 4.18, and 2.6, that further updates on these issues will be brought to future meetings of the subcommittee and board as required. Are we happy to agree with this? Thank you. Item 10, annual training plan. This is a standing item on the agenda and details the 2023-24 training plan. This report provides details of the training that has been completed over the last quarter. It also highlights that a knowledge and skills questionnaire will be issued to all members early in the new year to inform the 2024-25 training plan. Ross Fraser is here to answer any questions any members may have. Do we have any questions on the training plan? Nope. So if there are no questions, we'll just move straight to the recommendations. Members are asked to note 2.1, the updated record of training and training plan for 2023-24 in the appendix, and 2.2, that skills and knowledge questionnaire will be circulated to the members of the subcommittee and board early in the new year to inform them of the training plan for 2024. Thank you. So now we move on to any other business. I've not got any other business. So item 12, Local Government Scotland Act 1973, to consider the adoption of a resolution to exclude the public from the meeting in terms of section 58(4) and paragraph 6, part 1 of Schedule 7A of the Local Government Scotland Act 1973. Are we happy to do that? Are we ready to Are we switching to another meeting, or are we just...
There is an exempt team.